I call the member for Melbourne Ports.
Thank you very much, Acting Speaker. There hasn't been a scene like it since before the First World War, where the Kaiser reviewed the German High Seas Fleet. There in the South China Sea, standing on the deck of one of Beijing's newest warships, was China's leader, Xi Jinping, reviewing a sail past of the entire Chinese Navy, aircraft carrier, cruisers, destroyers, submarines on the surface, and flypasts of helicopters and the latest aircraft. Xi's naval review had the same purpose as that of the German Kaiser: intimidate your neighbours. Chinese aggressive military expansion in the South China Sea repudiates with contempt the solemn pledge he made while standing next to the American President Obama that he, as China's leader, would not militarise the South China Sea, let alone the repudiation of the International Court of Appeals that the South China Sea was an international high seas that no one had the right to militarise or to colonise rocky outcrops as islands. So what's the current situation in the South China Sea, where 50% of the world's maritime trade transits, where 60% of Australia's maritime trade transits, and where the Chinese President told Obama China, quote, does not intend to pursue militarisation. John Keogh in the Financial Review today quotes the new head of Pacific Command, the US Admiral Philip Davidson, who conceded that, quote, China is now capable of controlling the South China Sea in all scenarios short of war with the United States. This is further proof of what Fairfax International editor Peter Harcher catalogued on the ABC the other night, a tectonic shift in military power by China in the last 6 months. Apart from the deployment of long-range aircraft from the Paracels and presumably from the Spratlys, which could reach northern Australia, missiles of three Chinese have appeared on three Chinese-occupied features: Fiery Reef, Mischief Reef and Subi Reef. The weapons are YJ-12B anti-ship cruise missiles with a range of 295 nautical miles, and HQ-98B surface-to-air missiles which could hit projectiles, planes and drones within 160 nautical miles. So what effectively has happened is, with these missiles, all of the South China Sea is dominated, and merchant ships and naval ships can only sail there through as long as it's okay by Beijing. Brass generals in the PLA and ideological zealots in the Global Times brim with disdain at the decision of the International Court of Appeals that no country in the international rules-based system, including China, had the right to set up fake islands and claim sovereignty in the South China Seas, which were the high seas. Matching this warlike build-up by Beijing is their remorseless attempt to achieve a victory without kinetic conflict. Sharp power is what The Economist described it as. In Australia, it has come to be known as foreign interference. What are we talking about when we talk of foreign interference, Beijing's interference? Let's review it. Some months ago, the Secretary of the Department of Foreign Affairs, Francis Adamson, warned Beijing not to interfere in Australian universities. Later, small Liberal academic John Fitzgerald of Swinburne University in Melbourne documented Beijing's buyout of the Australian Chinese press. Even Green Party academic and enthusiast Clive Hamilton waxed passionate about it. His book looked at Beijing's political interference in Australia via political donations in the millions and through the APPRC, the local arm of the United Front Work Department, described by President Xi at the recent Communist Party Congress as China's magic weapon. In the media, of course, Four Corners famously exposed Beijing's pattern of donations to political parties and the use of front organisations to carry out the works of the United Front Department. In Beijing's corner, we have mining billionaire Twiggy Forrest, the principal business ally in Australia of Beijing, who attended the recent China's version of Davos, the Bao Forum, ironically on Hainan Island, where Beijing has its forward submarine base. Together with a bevy of media lackeys paid by him to attend, he complained that Australia's concerns about foreign interference and militarisation would spoil Australia's business commercial benefits from, in his case, selling vast amounts of iron ore to Beijing and to Chinese power plants. That's not what the figures of the Foreign Investment Review Board demonstrate. The Foreign Investment Review Board reports that in the years 2010 to 2016 financial years, there was $169 billion of direct investment in Australia by individuals and entities from China. Investment has risen from $16.9 billion in financial year 2010-11 to $47 billion in 2015 and 2016. That's a good thing, but it demonstrates that the concerns about China's investment being scared off by us asserting our sovereignty have little basis. A peak business body, unfortunately, of companies in China labelled political commentary out of Australia unhelpful. Someone called Udo Donning of the Shanghai Chamber of Australian Commerce said, "Our view and the view of our members is that we have nothing to gain and everything to lose if the bilateral relationship continues to worsen." I believe Beijing makes its decision and its companies on a commercial basis, as is demonstrated by the Foreign Investment Review Board. Of course, Australia is a proud country, a rich country with deep democratic traditions. We are the 12th largest economy in the G20. Parliament recently rebelled against signing of an extradition treaty with China, who executes 3,000 people a year and has a conviction rate of 99.6 in all crimes that come before court. Labor's Shadow Foreign Minister said today in the Australian Financial Review, Australia needs to better help Pacific Island neighbours to tacitly counter China's creeping influence with what some critics allege is a debt-trap diplomacy with small, poor nations. Penny Wong also sees herself as a pragmatist in foreign policy. She believes Australia should constructively try to shape China's behaviour in a positive fashion inside the international rules-based order. But thankfully in Australia there is pushback against the concerted attempts to arm twist Australia. China's sharp power is being dealt with by this parliament with legislation on foreign interference that I predict will go through after a review by the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security. And of course our Foreign Investment Review Board has stepped up to the mark, barring the acquisition of Ausgrid, not repeating the mistake of selling the Port of Darwin to a Beijing state-owned enterprise. Why was the Ausgrid decision important? Despite the Attorney-General's Department failure to advise the government, the sale of the key power asset may have compromised infrastructure that is critical to the support of the joint facilities in Pine Gap. They're, of course, the centrepiece of the ANZUS alliance. Some years ago, under pressure from Labor, who demanded a briefing by ASIO, Malcolm Turnbull, now Prime Minister, then Communications Minister, was forced to bar Huawei from bidding for the new core of Australia's telecommunications, the NBN. Now he and his government must resist the blandishments of commercial interests backed by apparently incompetent advice from bureaucrats who don't understand the implications of the sale of the 5G network to state-owned enterprises or China-based companies who are effectively controlled by Beijing. I'm talking about Huawei and ZTE. Both these telcos are subject to government or Communist Party dictates. Both Huawei and ZTE must report to a Communist Party cell at the top of their organisations. Let me issue a clarion call to this Parliament, to the media and to the Australian public. Australia's 5G network must not be sold to these telcos. Whatever instructions might be issued for Australian sovereignty by after the fact, it will be compromised if we sell the construction of our new central communications 5G network to companies effectively controlled by an authoritarian government whose leader has recently been made dictator for life. I am proud that Australia, like other countries, there is a pushback against this outrageous internal and external attempt to make us surrender to aggrandising power by Beijing. Of course, we must maintain good commercial relationships with China. It's a vast country, and we do admire the fact that hundreds of millions of people have been brought out of poverty by basically economic developments there. But I ask my fellow Australians to listen to the words of the Director General of ASIO, Duncan Lewis, that there has never been such a level of foreign interference in Australia. I urge them to listen to the words of small L Liberal editor at Fairfax and on the ABC, Peter Harcher, with his warnings the last few days, and even, and this is very unusual for me, draw attention of people to the book and the works and the writings of Green Party academic Clive Hamilton, whose descriptions of political interference in Australia were certainly true and ought to be paid attention to by all the Australian public.
I thank the member for Melbourne Ports for his contribution.